I never thought my life was perfect, but I believed it was normal. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday evening, in the most mundane setting imaginable, standing in the kitchen, washing dishes while my mom scrolled through her phone at the table. I had just turned 25. My parents had surprised me with a small celebration, the kind they always threw, just the three of us, a cake from the grocery store, and my dad making the same old joke about how I was too old to be his little girl, but too young to move out yet. I laughed, rolled my eyes, played along. That was our dynamic, predictable, safe, and routine. But I never realized how much of my life was fabricated, not until the call came. The phone buzzed loudly on the table. Mom glanced at it, and for just a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Tension. Fear. She picked up the phone, barely looking at me, and walked out of the kitchen. That was strange. Mom never ignored calls, not unless they were scams. I wasn't the kind of person who normally eavesdropped, but something about the way she had snatched the phone made my skin prickle. I moved closer to the door, straining to listen. "You can't just call here." Her voice was low, urgent. "No, I told you. We agreed." Silence. Then a whisper. "Not now. She doesn't know." I froze. She doesn't know? I felt an invisible fist curl around my stomach. Who doesn't know what? I heard Mom sigh sharply. "You need to leave us alone. Please. This is our life." There was something almost pleading in her voice. I took a step back, my mind racing. A dozen possibilities flooded my brain. Was she sick? Was there some huge family secret I had been oblivious to? The anxiety pressed into my ribs, suffocating. A few minutes later, she walked back into the kitchen, her expression carefully blank. I dried my hands, pretending like I hadn't heard a thing. "Who was that?" "Just a telemarketer," she said too quickly. I forced a laugh. "Since when do telemarketers make you look like you just saw a ghost?" She didn't smile. "It was nothing," she said, turning away, busying herself with wiping down the counter. But I knew better. That call wasn't nothing. And neither was the way her hands trembled as she held her coffee cup. I wanted to press her, to demand answers, but I knew my mother well. She wasn't the type to crack under pressure. If I pushed, she'd shut down. So I let it go. For now. But that moment planted a seed of doubt inside me. And it was about to grow into something I wasn't ready for. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the conversation in my head. It didn't matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking the way she spoke, the fear in her voice, the sheer urgency. It all felt wrong. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I really did. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't. The next few days, I started noticing things. Little details I had ignored before. Mom seemed distracted, always looking over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to show up uninvited. My dad didn't seem to notice anything, but maybe that was the point. Maybe he wasn't supposed to notice. And then, a week later, I found the papers. I was looking for a pair of scissors in my parents' office when I saw an old file cabinet, one I had seen a million times but never really paid attention to. Normally, I would have ignored it. But something inside me told me to open it. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled open the drawer. Inside were stacks of papers, bills, and old family documents. But then I saw something that made my stomach lurch. A birth certificate. My birth certificate. At first glance, it looked normal. My name, my birth date, my mom and dad's names. But the paper felt off. Too new. Too crisp for something that should have been over 2 decades old. My chest tightened. I flipped through the file, my fingers trembling. Beneath it was another document, an official-looking legal paper. I skimmed the words, my breath catching in my throat. Finalized adoption certificate, 1999. Adoption. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I read the paper again. Then again. But the words didn't change. The ink didn't disappear. For 25 years, my parents had lied to me. A suffocating nausea curled in my stomach. My vision blurred as I scanned the legal text, looking for an explanation, any explanation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was someone else's adoption papers. Then I saw it. the signature at the bottom. My mother's name, written in the same neat cursive she used on Christmas cards. It wasn't a mistake. It was real. I felt dizzy, like the ground beneath me had tilted. Everything I had ever believed about myself, my childhood, my parents, my identity, had just been ripped out from under me. I wasn't their daughter. At least, not by blood. My whole life, every childhood memory, every bedtime story, every scraped knee they had kissed better, had been built on a lie. I stuffed the papers back into the drawer, my hands shaking. My breaths were coming too fast, too shallow. My ears were ringing. I needed air. I needed answers. But more than anything, I needed to know who the hell I really was. And if my parents weren't going to tell me the truth, then I was going to find it myself. I wanted to storm into the kitchen, slam the adoption papers down on the table, and demand the truth right then and there, but I didn't. My hands were still shaking, my mind racing too fast to form a single coherent thought, and the last thing I wanted was to give my mother a chance to lie her way out of this. She was good at that, at controlling the flow of information, at only telling me what she thought I needed to know, and I wasn't about to give her the opportunity to twist the story into something that made me doubt what I had just seen with my own eyes. I needed to be smart about this, needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I confronted them, so instead of saying anything, I put everything back the way I found it, closed the drawer, and walked out of the office like nothing had happened. That night, I could barely eat. Every glance my mother threw in my direction felt heavier than usual, like she could sense something had shifted, like she knew I had found something I wasn't supposed to, but she didn't say anything. And I refused to acknowledge the way my stomach twisted every time she opened her mouth to speak. I could hear my father laughing at something on TV in the living room, completely unaware that the foundation of the life he had built with my mother had cracked beneath my feet. The house felt suffocating in a way it never had before, every sound amplified, every movement calculated, every breath measured, and I needed to get out before I lost my grip on the thin thread of composure I was barely holding onto. I left without an excuse, just grabbed my bag and walked out the door, not stopping until I was in my car with the engine running and my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could have driven anywhere, could have lost myself in the comfort of aimless movement, but instead, I found myself parked outside my best friend Lauren's apartment, staring up at the dimly lit windows, debating whether or not I even had the right to drop something this massive onto her without warning. It wasn't like I had processed any of it yet, wasn't like I even knew how I was supposed to feel, but I needed to say it out loud, needed to hear myself admit it to someone else just to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. When she opened the door, her eyes flicked over my face for half a second before she stepped aside to let me in without a single question. That was the thing about Lauren. She always knew when something was wrong, always knew when I was about to unravel, and she never pushed until I was ready to talk. I sat on her couch, staring down at my hands, trying to steady my breathing, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. I found out I was adopted. She didn't react right away, didn't gasp or ask me if I was joking, just sat there waiting for me to keep going, and for some reason, that made it easier to say everything else. I told her about the phone call, about the way my mother had been acting all week, about finding the papers in the drawer, about how my whole life had just shifted into something unrecognizable in the span of a single night. She listened, her expression unreadable, but when I finally stopped, when the last of the words had been dragged out of me, she exhaled slowly and said the only thing that mattered. "What are you going to do now?" I had been so caught up in the shock of it, in the weight of the discovery, that I hadn't even thought about the next step. I had been raised by these people for 25 years, had never once questioned where I came from, had never imagined that I had a whole other life that had been erased before I was even old enough to remember it, and now that I knew, I couldn't just go back to pretending everything was fine. I needed to know who I was before them, who had given me up, who had been important enough to be kept hidden from me for my entire life. I need to find out who my real parents are. Lauren nodded like she had expected that answer, like she had already started thinking of ways to help before I even said it out loud. That was another thing about her. She was always 10 steps ahead, always ready to act when I was too overwhelmed to figure out where to start. She grabbed her laptop from the table, opened it, and turned the screen toward me. Then let's start looking. I had no idea what I was supposed to be searching for, had no birth name, no details, just a set of legal documents with my mother's signature on them and a gut feeling that there was something bigger lurking beneath the surface of the secret. Lauren started with the obvious, trying to find any records of my adoption, but everything led to dead ends. My name wasn't attached to any publicly available documents, no court filings, no adoption agency records, nothing that could explain where I had come from before my parents had taken me in. It was like I didn't exist before them. I leaned back, rubbing my temples, frustration gnawing at the edges of my patience. There has to be something. A paper trail, a record, anything. Lauren tapped her fingers against the keyboard, deep in thought. What if it wasn't a legal adoption? What if they pulled some strings to make sure there wasn't any documentation? The thought made my skin crawl, but it wasn't impossible. My parents weren't powerful people, weren't the kind of people who could just make a child's entire history disappear. But what if someone else had done it for them? Lauren's eyes lit up like she had just pieced something together. What about DNA testing? If there's no paper trail, maybe we go straight to the source. If you're in a database, we might find a match to relatives. It was the only real lead we had, the only way to get answers without having to confront my parents and risk them shutting me down before I could find the truth on my own. I nodded, determination settling into my bones. Let's do it. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew that this wasn't just about finding my biological family. This was about uncovering why my parents had kept this a secret for so long, why they had been so afraid of someone contacting me after all these years, why they had gone out of their way to erase every trace of the life I had before them. And if they were hiding something this big, I needed to know the full truth, no matter what it was. Lauren ordered the DNA test that night, and the waiting began. I spent the next few weeks trapped in a strange limbo, pretending everything was normal while the reality of what I had discovered sat like a weight in my chest. My mother had no idea that I knew, but every time she looked at me, I felt like she could see it in my face, the way my eyes lingered on her for too long, the way I hesitated before answering even the simplest questions, as if I was testing every interaction for signs of dishonesty. My father, oblivious as ever, carried on with his daily routines, unaware that everything had changed, that I had changed. I kept my distance, making excuses to be out of the house as much as possible, avoiding long conversations, avoiding any situation where I might slip up and let something show. Every night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, running through every possibility in my mind, every scenario in which my parents had somehow justified this deception to themselves, every explanation that might make any of this make sense. But nothing did, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. When the test results finally arrived, I was too afraid to open them alone. I met Lauren at her apartment, the email sitting unread in my inbox, my hands shaking as I handed her my phone. She didn't hesitate, clicking it open without ceremony, her eyes scanning the results while I struggled to breathe normally. I watched her expression shift, something unreadable flashing across her face before she turned the screen toward me. The first thing that caught my eye was a name under close familial matches, a name I had never seen before, a name that wasn't common, a name that meant nothing to me. Lauren was already typing it into a search engine before I could even process what I was looking at, pulling up a social media profile within seconds. The face staring back at me belonged to a woman in her late 40s, her features sharp, her dark eyes intense, her hair pulled into a tight bun, professional, polished, but something about her face sent a chill through me. She looked familiar in a way I couldn't place, like a face from a dream, like someone I had seen in passing but never spoken to, like a stranger that wasn't really a stranger at all. Lauren was already scrolling through her profile, clicking through photos, scanning captions, reading through comments, searching for something that might tell us who she was beyond a name in a database. Then she stopped, her face going pale, her finger hovering over the screen as she turned the phone back toward me. The image on the screen was of a group of people at some kind of event, a charity fundraiser or a gala, everyone dressed formally, standing in front of a branded backdrop. But it wasn't the event that mattered, it was the people in the photo, or more specifically, one person. Standing just a few feet away from the woman whose name matched my DNA results was my mother. The blood drained from my face as I stared at the picture, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It wasn't an old photo, wasn't some blurry, grainy image from decades ago. It was recent, taken within the last year, and my mother looked comfortable, familiar, like she belonged there, like this wasn't just a chance encounter. Lauren didn't say anything, just let me sit with it, let me put the pieces together on my own, let me come to the only conclusion that made sense. My mother knew this woman, had known her for a long time, had been in her presence just months ago while I had spent my entire life not even knowing she existed. I felt sick, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone, scrolling through the woman's posts, looking for more, looking for anything that might tell me what my mother had been hiding all these years. The more I scrolled, the worse it got. There were more photos, more events, more signs that my mother had been involved in this woman's life in some way, that their connection wasn't just a coincidence. The comments were filled with people congratulating her on her work, calling her an inspiration, a leader, a force of change, a name that carried weight, power, influence. She wasn't just anyone, she was someone important, someone respected, someone known. I turned to Lauren, my voice unsteady. Who is she? Lauren was already reading through her biography, her expression tense. Her name is Rebecca Carter. She's a businesswoman, runs a few nonprofits, does a lot of philanthropy work. She's been in the news a few times, mostly for funding education initiatives, healthcare programs, that kind of thing. She hesitated, scrolling further. But there's something else. A few years ago, she was involved in a legal dispute. It was about parental rights. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? Lauren clicked on the article, skimming through it before reading aloud. It says she fought for custody of a child she claimed was taken from her under false pretenses. There was a whole case about it, but it got buried pretty quickly because there wasn't enough evidence to support her claim. The records are sealed, so there's not much detail, but from what I can see, she lost the case. I stared at her, my pulse pounding in my ears. How old was the child? Lauren scrolled down, reading further, then stopped, looking up at me with wide eyes. They were born in 1998. The room felt too small, the air too thick, the weight of the realization pressing down on me so hard I could barely stay upright. My entire body felt like it was vibrating with something electric, something furious, something that refused to be ignored. My mother hadn't just lied to me. She had stolen me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except sit there while the truth settled into my bones, irreversible, undeniable, inescapable. My mother had spent my entire life pretending that I was hers while another woman had spent hers trying to get me back. And if Rebecca Carter had been telling the truth all those years ago, if I really had been taken from her, then that meant my mother hadn't just kept a secret. She had committed a crime. I didn't know what to do with that information, didn't know how to process it, didn't know how to reconcile the woman who had raised me with the woman who had done something so monstrous. I had spent 25 years believing I was safe, believing I was loved, believing I belonged, but now I didn't know what was real anymore. Lauren's voice broke through the silence, quiet but firm. You need to talk to her. I shook my head, barely able to form words. I don't even know who she is anymore. She placed a hand on mine, grounding me. Then find out. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't close my eyes without seeing the photo, without seeing the name, without seeing everything I had ever known unraveling in front of me. But by the time the sun came up, I knew one thing for sure. I was going to get the truth. Even if it destroyed everything. I sat at the kitchen table, the unopened laptop in front of me, my mother moving around the room like everything was fine, like she hadn't spent the last 25 years living a lie. Like I hadn't spent the last few weeks discovering that nothing about my life was what I thought it was. She hummed softly as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her back to me, completely unaware that I had been watching her every move, analyzing every expression, listening for anything that might give away the truth before I forced her to admit it. My father was out for the afternoon, leaving just the two of us alone in the house, and I had no intention of waiting any longer. I cleared my throat, keeping my voice as steady as possible. How do you know Rebecca Carter? The sound of the spoon clinking against the ceramic cup stopped. The way her body tensed, the way her hand gripped the handle of the coffee pot a little too tightly, the way her shoulders lifted ever so slightly before she turned around, feigning confusion, made my stomach twist. Who? I pushed the laptop open, spinning it toward her so the image of her standing at a charity gala just a few feet away from the woman who had been looking for me my entire life was staring right back at her. The color drained from her face, her eyes darting to mine before flicking back to the screen, her lips parting like she wanted to say something but didn't know how to begin. I watched her chest rise and fall, her hands pressing against the counter, her knuckles whitening as she steadied herself. Why are you asking about her? I scoffed, the bitterness thick in my throat. Because she's my biological mother. Because I took a DNA test, and her name showed up. Because you told me my entire life that I was your daughter, but I wasn't, was I? My voice was rising now, my control slipping, the weight of my anger pressing against my ribs. You stole me, didn't you? Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with something unreadable, her lips pressing together into a thin line. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just looked at me, studied me, measured me the way she always did when she was trying to figure out the right thing to say, the way to manipulate the situation so she could stay in control. But this time, there was nothing she could say that would erase what I had already uncovered, no excuse that would justify what she had done. You don't understand, she finally said, her voice quiet, shaking just enough to make me hesitate. Then explain it to me, I shot back, pushing my chair away from the table, standing up so we were eye to eye, so she couldn't look down on me like a child who didn't know any better. Tell me why my entire life is a lie. Tell me why I had to find out from a DNA test that the woman who gave birth to me has been looking for me for years while you just pretended I belonged to you. Tell me why you. My voice cracked, my throat tightening, my anger slipping into something else, something raw, something closer to betrayal. Tell me why you did this to me. Her jaw clenched, her hands gripping the counter harder, and I could see it, the way she was fighting herself, the way she wanted to say something but couldn't, the way she was still trying to decide if she could find a way out of this, if there was still a way to make me believe whatever story she wanted me to believe. But she must have realized that there wasn't, that I wouldn't stop until I had the truth, because after a long, painful silence, she exhaled, closing her eyes, pressing her fingertips against her temples like she was trying to hold herself together. She wasn't supposed to have you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't deserve you. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me, my brain scrambling to process what she had just said, my hands curling into fists at my sides. What are you talking about? She opened her eyes, looking at me like she wasn't sure how much to say, how much I could handle, but I didn't care about what she thought I could handle. I needed the truth, all of it, no matter how ugly it was. She wasn't fit to be a mother. She was selfish, reckless, more concerned with her career than with the child she brought into the world. She wasn't there when you were born. She didn't care about you the way a mother should. Her voice wavered, but there was something desperate in it, something pleading, something that sounded too much like a justification instead of an admission of guilt. We were the ones who loved you, who gave you a home, who made sure you were safe. You weren't stolen, you were saved. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Saved? I repeated, my voice shaking with disbelief. You really think that's what this was? That you did the right thing? That you had the right to take me from her? She was going to give you away anyway, she said, her voice breaking, her expression unraveling. She didn't want you. She never wanted you. The words sliced through me, sharp and unforgiving, but I didn't believe them. I couldn't. Not after everything I had learned, not after seeing the legal battle she had fought to get me back, not after realizing she had never stopped looking for me. My mother, no, the woman who had raised me, was lying, trying to rewrite history the same way she had rewritten my life, trying to convince me that she had been right all along. I shook my head, stepping back, putting distance between us, because the more I looked at her, the more I felt like I was staring at a stranger. "You're a liar," I said, my voice flat, exhausted. "You've been lying to me my entire life." She flinched, like I had struck her, but I didn't care. "I need to see her," I said, my voice steadier now, more certain. "I need to hear her side of the story." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face, and for the first time, she looked afraid, truly afraid, like she was about to lose something she had fought too hard to keep. "No." I had expected that, had known she would try to stop me, had known she would do everything in her power to keep me from the truth. But she didn't have that power anymore. "I'm going," I said, turning toward the door, grabbing my keys, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "Please don't do this." I hesitated for just a second, my chest tight, my head spinning, but I forced myself to keep moving. I wasn't hers. I never had been. And I was done letting her pretend that I was. I sat in my car outside Rebecca Carter's office building, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The email I had sent her 3 nights ago had been short, just a name and a request to meet, nothing more, but her reply had come the next morning, a simple confirmation with an address and a time. No questions, no hesitation, like she had been expecting me to reach out, like she had been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. Now that I was here, staring up at the glass doors that led to the truth, I didn't know if I was ready. I had spent my whole life believing one thing, and in just a few weeks, everything had crumbled. My mother, no, the woman who had raised me, had done everything she could to keep me away from this place, from this person, from the truth I was about to hear. There was no going back after this, no pretending I didn't know, no living in ignorance. I took a breath, opened the door, and stepped out before I could talk myself out of it. The receptionist barely glanced at me before directing me to the elevator. The ride up felt longer than it should have, the quiet hum of the machinery the only sound as I watched the floor numbers change. When the doors opened, I was met with an empty hallway, a single door at the end with her name printed on it. My heart was pounding as I lifted my hand to knock, the weight of everything pressing against me, the uncertainty, the fear, the anger, all of it tangled together into something I couldn't unravel. The door opened before I could make contact. She stood there, looking at me like she had already memorized my face, like she had spent years wondering what I would look like if we ever stood in front of each other like this. Her eyes moved over me, taking in every detail, searching for something she already knew was there, something she had been robbed of seeing for 25 years. I didn't know what I had expected, maybe for her to cry, to reach for me, to fall apart, but she didn't. She just stepped aside and let me in. The office was nothing like I had imagined. It was simple, organized, no personal photos, no distractions, just a desk, a few chairs, and a window overlooking the city. I sat without waiting to be asked, because waiting meant giving myself more time to hesitate, and I couldn't afford that. She sat across from me, folding her hands on the desk, her face calm, unreadable. "You look just like him," she said finally, her voice quiet, steady. I didn't know who she meant, if she was talking about herself or someone else, but I didn't ask. It didn't matter. "I need to know everything." She nodded, like she had been expecting that too. "I tried to fight for you," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to soften it, no sugarcoating the truth the way my mother had done my entire life. "When you were born, I was in a situation I couldn't control. I was young, and the people around me convinced me that I couldn't handle raising a child, that I needed to focus on my career, on my life. They pushed me to make a choice I didn't want to make, and by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." She exhaled, her fingers pressing together. "But I changed my mind. I fought for you. I tried to get you back, but the adoption had already been finalized, and by then, they had covered their tracks too well. Your mother," she paused, correcting herself, "the woman who raised you, she had resources, she had people who helped make sure I couldn't find you. And when I did, when I finally gathered enough to take it to court, They buried it. I listened, my hands clenched together in my lap, my mind racing to keep up with everything she was saying. Why didn't you try again? Her lips pressed together, something flickering in her expression, something that looked like regret. I did, she said. More than once. Every time, they made it impossible. They moved, they changed numbers, they erased every trace of themselves from the places I could reach. I had no choice but to let it go, at least legally. But I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. She leaned forward, her voice softer now, less of a statement, more of a plea. I never stopped wanting you. I felt something tighten in my chest, something I couldn't name, something I didn't know how to process. My whole life, I had never felt unwanted, never questioned whether I belonged, never thought for a second that my mother, no, the woman who raised me, was capable of something so cruel. And yet, here I was, sitting in front of the person who had spent years trying to undo what had been done, the person who had fought for me when I didn't even know I needed fighting for. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, I admitted, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be, more vulnerable than I had planned. She nodded, understanding, not pushing. You don't have to do anything. I just wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you. I had expected her to ask for something, to want something from me, but she didn't. She just sat there, waiting, giving me the space to decide what happened next. And for the first time since I had uncovered the truth, I realized that I had a choice, that I had control over what came next, that I wasn't trapped in someone else's version of my life anymore. I need time, I said finally. Rebecca nodded, a small, understanding smile on her lips. Take as much as you need. I stood, hesitating for just a second before I turned toward the door. But before I reached it, I stopped, looking back at her, the woman who had given me life, the woman who had been waiting for this moment for longer than I had been alive. Do you regret it? She didn't ask what I meant. She already knew. She met my eyes, her voice steady, certain. Every day. I didn't say anything else. I just walked out, stepping back into the world with the truth finally in my hands, unsure of what I was supposed to do with it, but knowing, at the very least, that it was mine now.